Okay, so here to make this video to explain what happens when Venus goes into the 8th house in your birth chart. So what is Venus? Venus represents relationships and, romance and people that you encounter and be in relationships with in general. Um, Represents women, short and simple. So what is the 8th house? The 8th house represents taboo, occult, mysticism, astrology, sex, death, sudden events, your spouse and your in-laws, the wealth that you can gain from them, and the wealth that you can sort of gain from other people. Because the second house is your family and your wealth. So the opposite of the second house is the 8th house, which represents the wealth of other people's families or of your spouse's family and all that stuff. And this is a pretty good placement for Venus. With Venus being in the 8th house, you would meet your partner. You would generally meet most of your flings and little relationships. They would be secretive. They would be hidden. They wouldn't really be known, because like I said, the 8th house is a house of like secrecy, because tarot and porn and sex, all that stuff is typically things that sort of hidden, and things that are not normally discussed in like school. These are things that you have to go search and find. So therefore, the people that you be in relationships with, more than likely, they would be hidden. They would be low-key. Not too many people would know about them. Venus in the 8th house can make you someone naturally very sexual, very promiscuous. Venus in the 8th house can potentially point to you or your spouse, mainly your spouse, maybe having some hidden creative artistic abilities and talents, because Venus represents all those artistic creative abilities, and the 8th house is a house of secrecy. So you could date and attract people who maybe have these hidden secret talents, like a hidden maybe secret talent for singing, or some type of Venusian type thing is something that you could possibly see. Someone with Venus in the 8th house, they might naturally have an interest in wanting to learn about the occult, or explore and dive into things that are sort of considered to be taboo and forbidden and looked down upon in society. Because Venus, is just like romance and pleasure and stuff, and it's just in this sexual temptation house. Venus in the 8th house, you might possibly attract and date people who might have some wealth with them. I'm not saying that the person would be rich, but it's very likely, it's very possible, since Venus is a significator of wealth, that you could date people who might be financially good, financially stable, or whatnot. But yes, back to the reason that Venus would, really incline someone to really be into maybe pursuing astrology or tarot and Reiki. For the most part, mainly in tropical Western astrology, the occult mysticism themes around Venus isn't normally discussed that much. Venus is primarily a planet of relationships and love, but it also has some occult like meanings to it, because you see, the real planet Venus, in the world, in the universe, I don't know the exact science and calculations behind it, but this is a planet that seems to accordingly just appears and disappears, or just sort of like dips and vanishes out in the sky. You can go Google and look this up for yourself. And Venus in our birth chart, it rules the 2nd house and it rules the 7th house. Now, the 2nd house is also sort of known as sort of like the gates to Hades, the gates to hell, because if we was to look at the birth chart from like the perspective of like a clock or like a time of day, the 2nd house would represent maybe like I don't know, 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. Basically, the 2nd house is a house that represents sort of like nighttime, early in the morning. The sun is not even up. And then Venus rules the 7th house. The 7th house is known as the descendant. This is where the sun begins to set. The 7th house, the time of day of the 7th house is probably like, 5:30 or maybe 7 o'clock when the sun begins to set. So the 7th house is like where the sun begins to die, where the sun sets and it becomes dark. So because the 2nd house and the 7th house, which are two houses that Venus naturally rules, are naturally houses where it's darkness, where the sun doesn't exist, and in like real life, Venus sort of like dips and vanishes, in like the real, in the universe and stuff. Venus sort of has this, underground and this occult theme to it. And in Vedic sidereal astrology, because that's the mainly type of astrologer that I am, Venus, the deity that is representative of Venus is a guru, is a teacher known as Shukracharya. He is basically like a counterpart to the deity that rules the planet Jupiter, who is known as Brahaspati. And basically, short and simple, to not really get too lost in the sauce, especially for people who are beginners and new to astrology, especially the tropical Western astrology, people who are into Western astrology. Venus has underlying occultic themes to it. So naturally, Venus being in this 8th house can really point to someone being a great, maybe, healer and mysticist, or you could end up dating and attracting a person who might have some type of great healing abilities. If not metaphysical, it might be, in some other type of way, maybe medically or something. But that's essentially what happens when you have Venus go into the 8th house in your birth chart. And hope this gave you good insight and clarity on what happens when Venus goes into the 8th house in your birth chart. Thank you for watching.